Chapter 14: The Great Patriotic War. The German Blitzkrieg extends into the Soviet Union. In the spring of 1940, Hitler launched his long-feared invasion of Western Europe. German troops landed in Denmark and Norway in April 1940. A month later, German tanks and dive bombers raced through Belgium to strike the Netherlands and France. This was Germany's Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. The strategy relied on speed and overwhelming force to shatter the ranks of its enemies. The results were stunning. Within 2 months, virtually all of Western Europe fell before the Nazi onslaught. Only a battered Great Britain held on, bracing for an invasion across the English Channel from Nazi-occupied France. Stalin watched with apprehension as the Germans carved up the armies of Western Europe. He knew it was only a matter of time before Hitler looked eastward again. But when it finally happened, the Germans caught Stalin unprepared. In June 1941, military intelligence began warning Stalin that German units were massing along the Soviet border. Stalin refused to believe that they would attack before Great Britain had surrendered. Stalin ignored all warnings and refused to put the Red Army on highest alert. He did not want to do anything to increase the tensions with the Germans. The German leader, however, did not need an excuse. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. German aircraft struck deep inside the USSR. The Blitzkrieg tore huge gaps in the Red Army's defenses. German infantry and tanks sped across Ukraine and Western Russia. They took aim at Kiev, Moscow, and Leningrad. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers were cut off and captured. Some Soviet citizens were ready to welcome the Germans as liberators from Stalin's dictatorship. They were never given the chance. German troops brutalized both soldiers and civilians in captured territory. In June 1941, thousands of German tanks poured into the Soviet Union. By October, they were closing in on Moscow. Special units trailed the German army to massacre Jews, Roma, and other groups. Eventually, 6 million Jews would perish in the Holocaust, Hitler's systematic murder of Europe's Jews. Over 2 million of the victims were killed on Soviet territory. Within a month, German troops had pushed the Soviet Union to the brink of defeat. The Red Army had already lost 2 million men, 3,500 tanks, and more than 6,000 aircraft. The German force was dropping bombs on Moscow by the end of July. The German army surrounded Leningrad on September 9th and captured Kiev 10 days later. With catastrophe looming, Soviet citizens rallied to defend their homelands. Workers disassembled entire factories and shipped them 1,000 miles east to the remote Ural Mountains. Collective farm workers destroyed crops rather than let them fall into German hands. Laborers put in longer hours on assembly lines and produced tanks, planes, and guns by the thousands. Stalin did what he could to encourage the new patriotic spirit. He relaxed censorship rules. He replaced Communist Party slogans and propaganda with appeals to rescue Mother Russia. The war itself became known as the Great Patriotic War. But while Stalin used a carrot to motivate citizens, he reserved the stick for his soldiers. Red Army officers received orders to execute deserters and troops who fled from battle. More than 150,000 soldiers were shot in 1941 and 1942 alone. Red Army troops learned to fight to the bitter end, out of fear, if not courage. In October 1941, German tanks closed in on Moscow for what Hitler insisted would be the last great decisive battle of the war. Stalin, however, decided to make a stand. He ordered most party members to evacuate the city. The bulk of the civilian population either fled or enlisted in the army. Even Lenin's embalmed corpse was carted away to the Ural Mountains. Stalin himself stayed in Moscow and made sure that his decision was heavily publicized. Pass on to your comrades that they should take their spades and dig their own graves, he told an army commissar. We are not leaving Moscow. Nazi troops execute 2 Soviets in October 1941. The victims may have been Soviet partisans, civilians who fought against the Nazis. Stalin's gamble paid off. The Red Army fought fiercely in the suburbs of Moscow and held the Germans off until winter arrived. When the snows finally came, the German invasion froze in place. Weapons and tanks failed in the rigid cold. Supplies ran low as transport vehicles stalled on snowbound tracks. When spring came, the people of Moscow and Leningrad were starving, but they still refused to surrender. Stalin also had a powerful new ally, the United States. The Americans had entered the war after Japan, Germany's ally, attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Stalin had always considered the capitalist U.S. to be one of the Soviet Union's most bitter enemies. But now he eagerly accepted the U.S. as a partner in the fight against Germany. Together with Great Britain and other countries, they formed a powerful alliance known as the Allies. In June 1942, Hitler ordered a new assault, this time on the city of Stalingrad. German forces surged into the city, but could not capture it. The buildings were blasted to rubble, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians died in one of the deadliest battles in history. Hitler demanded his men to take the city or die trying. Most died trying. In November 1942, the Red Army launched a bold counterattack, codenamed Operation Uranus. Within 4 days, the Soviets had encircled some 330,000 enemy troops. They blocked the enemy's supply lines and fought the Germans street to street, building to building. On February 2, 1943, the top German general finally surrendered. The last 90,000 of his freezing, starving men were captured. The Red Army had finally begun to dismantle Hitler's war machine. Red Army soldiers defeated the Germans at Stalingrad in February 1943 after 6 months of brutal fighting. Only 5,000 Germans who attacked Stalingrad survived the war to return to Germany.